He simply decided to fix the roof of his house himself, expecting nothing unusual. But under the roof, he discovered something that had been hidden from everyone for decades. The find terrified him so much that he immediately called 911, and after that, life on the entire street changed. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The house had never been part of a dream. It had been a calculation, a compromise made at a point in life where hope was no longer loud but practical. For years, the man who now owned it had lived from lease to lease, carrying his belongings in boxes that grew more battered each time they were moved. Each apartment had come with the same warnings disguised as polite notices. The rent would increase, the building would be sold, renovations would require temporary relocation that somehow became permanent. Stability had always belonged to other people, people whose lives seemed anchored to addresses that did not change every few years. He had learned early that nothing unsettles a person quite like the inability to say where they would be living 6 months from now. Owning a home, for him, was never about pride or status. It was about safety, about waking up knowing no one could knock on the door and tell him that the walls he slept behind were no longer his concern. When he finally saw the listing for the house on the edge of town, the price alone told its story. It was far below market value, low enough to raise suspicion even among buyers desperate for bargains. The photos were carefully chosen, taken from angles that softened the damage, that framed age as character rather than neglect. The description used words like potential and opportunity, but it also included phrases that spoke more honestly to those who knew how to read between the lines. As is. Needs work. No disclosures available. He bought it anyway. The decision came after nights of staring at spreadsheets and bank statements, after realizing that the same money he was throwing into rent could instead go into something broken that at least belonged to him. He understood the risks. The inspector had been blunt, listing issues without embellishment, warning that repairs would not be cosmetic. The roof alone was flagged as a looming problem, its age measured not in years but in eras. Yet the man signed the papers with a steady hand, because instability had already taught him how expensive fear could be. Better to face known problems than continue drifting through temporary spaces that never truly felt like his. The town itself did little to welcome newcomers. It was small, settled, and shaped by long memory. The main streets were lined with brick storefronts whose signs had barely changed in decades, while the residential areas grew increasingly uneven the farther one traveled from the center. His street sat at the boundary between upkeep and abandonment, where houses still stood but seemed tired of standing. Lawns were mowed just enough to avoid fines, paint peeled in layers that told quiet stories of deferred care, and porches sagged with the patience of structures that had learned to endure. Neighbors watched him from behind curtains during the first weeks. They offered nods but not names, greetings without invitations. He sensed the quiet evaluation that followed him when he walked down the block, the unspoken curiosity about why someone like him would choose a place like this. He did not ask questions, and neither did they. In towns like this, familiarity was earned through time, not conversation. The house itself appeared almost gentle from the outside. Its pitched roof rose high above the narrow structure, giving it an oddly dignified silhouette despite the wear. The siding bore the marks of age, but it was intact. The front door, though warped, closed with reassuring weight. Even the small attic window beneath the roof line added a touch of character, suggesting a space once used and now forgotten. It was only after stepping inside that the house revealed its true condition. The floors dipped where footsteps had worn them thin. The walls bore hairline cracks that spidered outward from windows and door frames, evidence of decades spent settling and shifting. The smell inside was not unpleasant, but it was heavy, layered with old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic that he could never quite identify. The attic, accessed by a narrow hatch in the ceiling, unsettled him most. It was not just the clutter or the heat trapped beneath the roof. It was the sense that the space had been altered and then ignored, like a room that no longer wished to be remembered. He tried to make peace with the house slowly. He repaired what he could, patched what he could not yet afford to fix properly. Each improvement felt earned, a small reclaiming of control. He learned the rhythm of the building, the way it creaked differently depending on the temperature, the way certain rooms held cold longer than others. Still, he never fully trusted it. There was a guardedness to the house, an impression that it was holding something back, though he could never explain why he felt that way. Money remained tight. Every repair competed with groceries and utility bills, and hiring professionals was rarely an option. He learned to do things himself, not out of confidence, but necessity. He read manuals, watched instructional videos late into the night, borrowed tools when he could. The house demanded constant attention, and he gave it what he could, believing that persistence might eventually turn it into something reliable. The roof was the one problem he could not ignore forever. After each storm, new stains appeared on the ceilings, spreading slowly like ink and water. Buckets and towels became temporary solutions, but they were humiliating reminders that the house's greatest weakness lay directly above him. Contractors gave estimates that might as well have been written in another language. Each number confirmed what he already knew. He could not afford them. When the storm came, it arrived without drama at first. Rain began softly, tapping against the windows in a way that almost sounded comforting. He assumed it would pass as so many others had, but the sound intensified, becoming heavier, more deliberate, as if the sky had decided to empty itself all at once. By nightfall, the rain was relentless. He lay awake, listening to it pound against the roof, aware of every groan and shift above him. The first drop fell near the living room window. It landed on the floor with a soft but unmistakable sound. He sat up, listening, hoping it was a fluke. It was not. Another drop followed, then another, each marking the beginning of something he had been trying not to face. He moved through the house, placing containers beneath the leaks, watching water trace paths along the ceiling that he had never noticed before. By morning, the damage was undeniable. The smell of damp wood filled the rooms and the stains had darkened, permanent marks of the house's failure to protect itself. Standing in the quiet aftermath of the storm, he understood that delay was no longer an option. Another night like that could cause structural damage far beyond his ability to repair. He stood beneath the damaged ceiling and looked upward, knowing that the solution waited somewhere above, even if he was not ready to face what it might reveal. The decision to climb onto the roof felt heavier than it should have. Heights had never been kind to him. A fall years ago had taught him respect for gravity, and ever since, he avoided situations that placed him too far from solid ground. But fear did not pay for repairs, and it did not stop water from finding its way inside. If the house was going to remain his, he would have to meet it on its own terms. He prepared carefully, treating the task like a ritual rather than a repair. He inspected the ladder twice, securing it firmly against the side of the house. He gathered tools slowly, checking and rechecking his supplies, as though thoroughness might protect him from what he could not predict. He charged his phone fully and slipped it into his pocket, telling himself it was only for emergencies, though he could not define what kind he expected. Before climbing, he paused in the yard and looked up at the roof. From below, it appeared unchanged, as if the storm had left no mark at all. Neighbors moved in the distance, some glancing his way before looking elsewhere. He felt their attention without acknowledging it, aware that this act of self-repair marked him as different, perhaps reckless, perhaps desperate. He took a breath and placed his foot on the ladder. Each step upward tightened his chest, but he kept moving, focusing on the immediate task rather than the fear creeping at the edges of his thoughts. By the time he reached the roof line, his hands were slick with sweat despite the cool air. He pulled himself onto the roof and sat there briefly, letting his body adjust, listening to the faint sounds of the neighborhood below. Up close, the roof told a different story than it had from the ground. Materials from different periods overlapped in ways that made little structural sense. Repairs had been layered rather than replaced, each one hiding the damage beneath it rather than addressing the source. As he shifted his weight, he noticed areas that responded differently, some solid, others hollow. The house was older than its appearance suggested, and its roof bore the scars of every decade it had endured. He moved slowly, inspecting the sections above the rooms that had suffered the worst leaks. The pattern was inconsistent, and that unsettled him. Water followed paths of least resistance, but here the paths seemed intentional, guided. He felt it again, that faint sense that the house had been shaped by decisions rather than neglect alone. As he worked, the morning sun climbed higher, warming the roof and easing his tension slightly. Yet, beneath that surface calm, something lingered. The house, silent and unmoving, seemed to wait. And though he could not yet name the reason, he felt certain that repairing the roof would demand more than nails and patches. It would demand answers, and he was already standing at the threshold of questions he had never meant to ask. He stayed seated for a moment longer than he intended, letting the steady rhythm of his breathing reassert itself against the height. From this angle, the street looked smaller, as if the neighborhood had been pressed flat and quiet, but the sounds below remained familiar. A distant car, the faint clatter of a trash bin being dragged across concrete, the muted bark of a dog somewhere behind a fence. Those ordinary noises should have grounded him. Instead, they made the roof feel even more separate, like a thin, precarious world suspended above everyday life. He reminded himself that he had climbed up here for a simple reason. The house leaked. The house needed to be protected. That was all. Yet, as soon as he began moving across the shingles, the roof refused to behave like a simple surface. Its texture changed under his hands and knees in subtle ways. Some areas gave him the reassuring resistance of dry, sound wood beneath the covering. Other areas felt strangely empty, as if his weight passed over pockets of air. The differences were not random. They carried a kind of pattern, one that suggested human choices rather than wear. He made himself go slowly. He tested each step before committing his weight. The roof had that particular scent that old structures carry after rain: warmed tar, aged pine, a hint of dampness lingering in places where the sun could not reach. He followed the lines where the shingles met and overlapped, looking for gaps, for lifted edges, for anything that might explain why water had found its way inside. The first signs were what he expected: hairline separations, cracked material, nails pushed up like stubborn bones, a roof that had lived too long. Then he began to notice what didn't fit. Near the center ridge, sections of the covering had been replaced at different times, but not with any consistency. A patch of newer shingles sat beside older ones, but the transition was too neat, too carefully tucked. In places, the nails were not just newer, they were of a different type entirely, the heads wider, the metal less corroded. Someone had not simply repaired the roof when it failed. Someone had worked on it with a more specific purpose. He crawled toward the area above the living room where the first drops had fallen during the storm. The ceiling beneath that spot had bloomed with a dark stain like bruising. The leak had not been a single point of entry. It had spread, as if water had traveled along a hidden seam. Up here, he searched for that seam, tracing the path where moisture might have gathered and slipped through. He found an old line of caulk, hardened and cracked, applied years ago with a hurried hand. He found an area where the underlayment had been doubled, not to strengthen it, but to cover something. That realization unsettled him more than the leak itself. It was not unusual for old houses to carry traces of improvised repairs. Most people did what they could with what they had. But these repairs felt less like desperation and more like concealment. The way certain pieces had been pressed down too tightly, the way edges were cut and tucked as if to create a lid rather than a surface, the way one stretch of roof seemed slightly raised compared to the rest. His eyes kept returning to that raised section, because even when he looked away, his body sensed it. The roof there did not sit flush. It rose by a fraction, almost nothing, yet enough to interrupt the otherwise aging uniformity. The spot was near the front slope, not far from the attic window. That made sense in the simplest way. If the roof leaked, it would leak where the structure was weakest, and the area near the attic often suffered first. But the lift was too even, too deliberate. It did not sag or bulge as water damage might cause. It looked like an adjustment someone had made carefully, as though ensuring the overlap of materials would disguise an access point. He told himself not to invent mysteries where there were none. He reminded himself that he was tired, that he had slept poorly during the storm, that nerves and height could make ordinary things seem ominous. He pressed his palm against the raised edge. It felt firmer than it should, as if something beneath it resisted pressure from above. He shifted closer, his knees scraping lightly against the grit that years had embedded into the shingle surface. Up close, the raised section revealed a small but significant detail, a faint line that ran perpendicular to the shingle's natural pattern, like a seam where two different layers met. It was nearly invisible unless the light hit it at the right angle. He tilted his head and watched how the sun caught it. The line remained. A seam, not a crack, not a random split. A seam. His throat tightened. He could feel the moment hovering between choice and consequence, the way it does before you open a door you are not meant to notice. His hands moved almost of their own accord, reaching for the flat bar he had brought up. It was a simple tool, worn at the edges, familiar in his grip. He slid it under the raised lip gently, testing. The material resisted at first, then yielded with a dry, brittle sound like old glue given up. One shingle lifted. Too easily. That was what struck him first. Old shingles, even damaged ones, did not come loose without a fight. They clung, warped, cracked, tore. This one rose as if it had been placed to be removed. He lifted it further, exposing a second layer beneath, and that layer did not match what he expected. Instead of underlayment and board, there was a plank laid crosswise, newer than the surrounding wood but not new. Its grain was darker, as if it had been handled and then left to age. Nails held it, but the nails were spaced in a way that suggested temporary fastening. Not sloppy, not permanent. He swallowed and shifted his weight, careful not to widen the opening too much. He pried up another shingle, another plank, another seam. The roof here was not just patched, it was constructed like a cover, layered with intention. A lid over something. The air above the opening felt slightly cooler. When he pulled back the third piece, he saw darkness below. Not the shadowed darkness of insulation or empty attic space, but a deeper void, compact and enclosed. He turned on his phone's flashlight and angled it downward. The beam caught dust suspended in the air like fine ash. It illuminated webs stretched thickly between beams. It revealed, at the edge of the light, shapes that were not part of the house's structure. At first, he could not make sense of them. His mind tried to categorize them as boards, as insulation bundles, as old junk someone had pushed into a tight space. Then the light struck at just the right angle, and he saw the corner of something wrapped, the curve of fabric folded or tied. He saw another shape beside it, more rigid, rectangular, a box or a crate. He moved the light slowly, the way you do when you fear what you might confirm. The objects were arranged with a precision that did not belong to forgotten junk. They were aligned, tucked into the far end of the cavity as if someone had measured the space and planned their placement. Dust coated everything thickly, suggesting years, perhaps decades, without disturbance. Yet the careful arrangement gave the impression of a mind that had wanted the items to remain as they were. His heartbeat grew loud in his ears. He sat back on his heels, breathing shallowly. The roof, the neighborhood, the quiet sounds below, all of it felt distant. There was only the opening and the darkness beneath it. A part of him wanted to stop immediately, to slide the pieces back into place, to press them down, to pretend he had never seen what lay below. He imagined himself finishing the roof repair somewhere else, leaving this raised section untouched, convincing himself that it was none of his business. But that thought did not last. The knowledge had already settled into him like a stone. Whatever was hidden there existed in his house, above his head. And if it was heavy enough to create that subtle lift in the roof line, it was not trivial. He leaned forward again and reached into the cavity. The air smelled stale, carrying the musty scent of enclosed wood and something metallic, faint but unmistakable. His fingers brushed against rough fabric. He pulled back quickly, as if stung, not because the fabric hurt him, but because the sensation made it real. Not imagination, not paranoia. A hidden storage space with objects inside. The simplest explanation was that some previous owner had used the cavity as a place to stash valuables. Money, jewelry, papers. Anything that might be hidden quickly and forgotten later. People did that. He had heard stories, yet the care with which the roof had been layered over the cavity suggested something more deliberate than a desperate hiding spot. This wasn't the kind of stash made in panic. It was built into the house like a secret room, a feature meant to be used and then erased. He tried to reason his way through the moment, but reason slid off the strange seam like water off tar. The roof itself was compromised now. He could not leave the opening unaddressed. If it rained again, water would pour into the cavity, ruin whatever lay inside, and perhaps seep deeper into the structure. Even if the objects were worthless, even if they were nothing but old rags, he would have to handle them. He forced himself into a practical mindset. He would not open anything up here on the roof. It was too risky. If the items were heavy, they could shift unexpectedly. If they contained sharp edges, he could cut himself. If they were fragile, he could damage them. And if they were something dangerous, he did not want to be exposed while perched on a roof with nowhere to retreat. He needed to bring them down, carefully, into a safer space. The attic, at least, was enclosed, grounded. He could handle them there if he had to, or he could call someone if the situation demanded it. He glanced toward the attic window and considered how best to move the objects without losing control. He widened the opening just enough to see more clearly. The cavity extended between beams, a narrow crawl space that paralleled the roof line. It was not large enough for a person to fit easily, but it was large enough to store several bulky items. He counted quickly in his head as his light moved across the shapes. 1, 2, 3. More than 3. At least 5 distinct bundles or boxes. 5. That number alone made his mouth go dry. No one hid 5 heavy bundles by accident. He reached in again, this time gripping one of the bundles firmly. It resisted, wedged between the framing and the other stored items. He tugged gently, feeling it shift. The bundle was heavier than he expected, dense with something rigid inside. It was wrapped in fabric that felt coarse, like burlap or heavy canvas, though time had softened it. He maneuvered it toward the opening, inch by inch, taking care not to scrape it against nails or splinters that might tear it. When it finally emerged into the light, he saw more detail. The fabric was dust-coated and tied with a kind of clasping mechanism he could not fully see from his angle. Metal glinted beneath the grime. He set the bundle on the roof beside him and stared at it, his chest tightening again. The metal did not look like a cheap modern buckle. It looked older, purposeful, designed to hold tight for a long time. He pulled out a second bundle, then a third, each one heavy in its own way. One felt like it contained stacked objects, perhaps books or files. Another felt more irregular, as if filled with folded fabric. The last 2 were tucked farther back, and he had to stretch into the cavity to reach them, his shoulders straining. By the time he retrieved the 5th, sweat had returned to his palms despite the wind. The bundles lay lined up beside him like silent witnesses. From the street, anyone looking up would have seen only a man working on his roof, perhaps lifting debris, perhaps repairing. They would not have seen what lay at his knees. He glanced down toward the yard and caught movement at the edge of his vision. A neighbor across the street had stepped onto their porch. Another, farther down, had paused in their driveway. He could not tell if they were watching him or simply noticing the unusual sight of someone on a roof, but the awareness made him move more cautiously. He had to get the bundles inside without drawing attention. He could not hide the fact that he was doing repairs, but he could minimize the spectacle. He secured a rope around the first bundle, knotting it carefully the way he had tied loads before when moving furniture. He tested the rope's strength with a hard pull. Then he eased the bundle toward the attic window opening and began to lower it. The rope bit into his hands as the weight shifted. He controlled it inch by inch, careful not to let it swing and strike the siding. The bundle passed the window frame and disappeared into the darkness of the attic. He crouched lower, feeling the roof's gritty surface under his knees, and guided the rope until the weight settled below. He repeated the process with the second bundle, then the third. Each descent felt like lowering something alive, something that might break free if he misjudged the balance. By the time he lowered the 5th, his arms were trembling from strain. He took a moment to wipe his hands on his jeans and look back at the opened section of roof. The cavity now stood empty, a dark mouth between beams. He could see the impression where the bundles had rested, outlines in dust like shadows left behind. He felt exposed, as if by removing the hidden contents he had also removed a layer of protection that had been guarding him from whatever history the house carried. He replaced the planks temporarily, sliding them back into position. He laid the shingles over the seam as best he could and pressed them down. It was not a proper repair. It was a cover, a temporary closing of a secret he could no longer pretend didn't exist. He would have to return to fix the roof properly later, but his mind had already moved beyond leaks and nails. He climbed down from the roof with more haste than grace. The ladder felt shakier than before, or perhaps his legs simply shook more. When his feet finally reached the ground, he stood still in the yard and let the solid earth steady him. For a moment, he considered walking away, leaving the bundles where they lay in the attic, shutting the hatch and pretending it could wait. But the thought of those heavy clasped packages sitting above him in the dark made his skin crawl. He went inside and moved through the house toward the hallway where the attic hatch waited in the ceiling. The air indoors still held the dampness left by the storm. The stains on the ceiling seemed darker now, as if they too knew they were no longer the central problem. He pulled down the hatch, and the ladder creaked as it unfolded. The attic greeted him with heat trapped from the sun and the same layered scent he had always noticed but never understood. Dust rose under his footsteps. He swung his flashlight beam across the rafters until it found the bundles resting on the boards, lined up where the rope had lowered them. In the confined light, the fabric looked even rougher, even more ancient. The metal clasps reflected weakly, dull under grime. He approached them carefully, as if proximity alone might trigger consequences. Up here, surrounded by beams and shadows, he felt the house's silence deepen. The roof above him held its repaired seam like a closed eyelid, but beneath that lid, the secret had already been brought into his space. His throat tightened with the same unease he had felt on the roof, only now it had nowhere to dissipate. The attic enclosed it, pressed it close, made it intimate. He knelt beside the nearest bundle and hovered his hand over the clasp without touching it. 1,000 explanations flickered through his mind, none satisfying. He told himself again that he would not open anything impulsively, that he would proceed carefully, rationally, that he would treat this as a matter of safety and property, nothing more. But he could not ignore the simple truth of the moment. The roof had not merely failed, it had revealed. The raised shingles, the layered planks, the hidden cavity, the heavy bundles sealed with old metal, all of it pointed to a purpose that had nothing to do with weatherproofing. The house had carried a secret built into its very structure, and now he had brought that secret down into his hands. He remained kneeling there, listening to the faint creaks of the attic settling around him. Outside, life continued with ordinary indifference. Inside, he felt as if he had stepped into a different version of the world, one in which a simple repair could expose something buried and waiting. The bundles lay still, but in his mind they began to take on weight beyond their physical mass, as if they were not merely objects but messages from a past that had been sealed away above the ceiling and forgotten by everyone except the house itself. The attic had always been a place he avoided, not because it frightened him outright, but because it carried a kind of quiet that pressed inward. Now that quiet felt heavier, altered by the presence of the bundles resting on the wooden boards. They did not belong there in the way old furniture or discarded boxes belonged. They looked placed, considered, as if the attic were not merely a storage space but a destination chosen for a reason. He stood at the base of the ladder for a long moment before climbing fully inside, listening to the sounds of the house below, grounding himself in the fact that the world had not shifted simply because he had discovered something hidden. When he stepped onto the attic floor, dust rose in a soft cloud, catching the beam of his flashlight. The air was thick and warm, layered with the smell of aged wood and long-settled debris. He moved slowly, careful with his footing, because the boards creaked in places that suggested fatigue rather than strength. The attic sloped sharply toward the edges, following the pitch of the roof, and the beams cast long shadows that made the space feel narrower than it was. In one corner, insulation sagged like forgotten bedding. In another, old nails and scraps of lumber lay scattered, remnants of repairs made and abandoned. The bundles sat closer to the center, where the floor felt most solid. He had not consciously chosen that spot when lowering them, but now he realized his instincts had guided him toward stability. He circled them once, scanning for anything out of place. The fabric was uniformly dusty, coated in the same fine layer that covered the rest of the attic, but the way the dust lay suggested they had not been disturbed for a very long time. There were no fresh handprints, no smudges, no signs that anyone had checked on them in recent years. Whatever their purpose had been, it belonged firmly to the past. Still, something about them refused to feel inert. Perhaps it was the metal clasps, each one shaped with a precision that did not belong to improvised storage. They were not decorative, nor were they cheap. They looked functional, designed to be opened and closed repeatedly without failing. He leaned closer and examined one, angling the light to catch its details. The metal bore faint markings, worn smooth by time, but the craftsmanship remained evident. This was not something bought casually at a hardware store. He straightened and looked around the attic again, this time with a different awareness. He had always thought of the space as neglected, but now he noticed details he had overlooked. Certain beams bore pencil marks, faint lines that did not match construction measurements. On one joist, a number was etched shallowly, almost invisible unless the light struck it just right. On another, a short series of slashes, like tally marks, had been carved and then sanded down, though not enough to erase them completely. These were not random. They were intentional, and they hinted at activity that had once taken place up here. A chill crept along his spine despite the warmth. He realized that the attic had not merely been used as a hiding place. It had been worked in, altered, marked. Someone had spent time here, enough time to leave traces that went beyond simple storage. The thought made the house feel less like an object and more like a witness, one that had absorbed actions and intentions without ever revealing them. He knelt beside the nearest bundle and resisted the urge to open it fully. Instead, he examined it from the outside, looking for clues that might tell him what he was dealing with without crossing a line he was not ready to cross. The fabric was coarse and thick, reinforced at the edges as if meant to protect its contents from wear. The ties were knotted in a practiced way, symmetrical and tight. Whoever had bound this knew what they were doing. The weight distribution suggested folded items layered carefully rather than dumped in haste. His thoughts turned inevitably to the people who had lived in the house before him. He tried to recall what little he knew. The cellar had been distant, represented by an agent who deflected questions with rehearsed vagueness. The records showed a chain of ownership that stretched back decades, but there were gaps, periods where the house changed hands quickly or was listed under trusts rather than individuals. At the time, he had assumed it was a matter of inheritance or financial maneuvering. Now, those gaps took on a different tone, as if they were intentional blind spots. The awareness that he was a black man standing alone in an attic full of hidden objects with unknown significance sharpened his unease. This was not an abstract fear. It was grounded in history, in stories passed down, in the knowledge that certain kinds of secrets had been hidden precisely to harm people like him. The possibility lodged itself in his mind and refused to leave. If these items were connected to hatred, to violence, to ideologies that thrived on invisibility, then discovering them was not merely a matter of property ownership. It was a personal threat. He forced himself to slow his breathing and focus on facts. He had not opened anything fully yet. He did not know what the bundles contained. Fear would not serve him until he had more information. Carefully, deliberately, he reached for the smallest bundle, the one that had felt lighter than the others when he lowered it from the roof. He loosened the outer knot just enough to peel back a corner of the fabric. The smell that escaped was not dramatic, but it was distinct. Old cloth, dry and slightly sour, mixed with the metallic tang he had noticed earlier. He lifted the edge further and shone his light inside. What he saw made his chest tighten. Folded fabric lay within, white or once white, now yellowed by age. The folds were precise, the edges aligned as if the items had been prepared for inspection rather than storage. Beneath the top layer, darker shapes suggested additional pieces, perhaps accessories or insignia. He did not need to see more to understand that this was not harmless memorabilia. The style of the fabric, the rigidity of its folds, the way it had been stored, all pointed to ceremonial use. He had seen images in books, in documentaries, in exhibits that spoke of an era he had hoped belonged firmly to the past. The realization did not arrive as a single blow, but as a slow, spreading cold. He closed the fabric again, his hands trembling slightly, and sat back on his heels. For a moment, the attic seemed to close in on him. The beams felt lower, the air heavier. His mind raced ahead, drawing connections he did not yet want to confirm. He thought of the town's history, of stories whispered rather than taught, of events that had been recorded without context. He thought of the neighbors who watched quietly, of the way some questions were never answered directly. The possibility that his house had been a part of something dark and organized no longer felt far-fetched. He stood and moved to the second bundle, the one that had felt more rigid. He hesitated longer this time, weighing the cost of knowing against the danger of ignorance. In the end, the decision made itself. He loosened the clasp and lifted the lid just enough to peer inside. Papers. Stacks of them, neatly bound, some wrapped in oilcloth, others simply tied with string. The edges were brittle, yellowed, but the handwriting visible on the top sheet was clear. Names, dates, locations. His pulse quickened. He did not read deeply yet, but he did not need to. The structure of the documents was enough. These were not personal letters or family records. They were lists, notes, perhaps minutes of meetings or logs of activities. The organization implied by their order was chilling. This was administration, planning, coordination. As he replaced the lid, his gaze drifted to the remaining bundles. 5 in total. 5 separate caches, each with its own weight and character. The scope of it settled on him with quiet force. This was not a single relic, not a forgotten costume or an old box of shameful keepsakes. This was an archive, a deliberate one. He began to notice other details in the attic that now seemed relevant. The way the floorboards beneath the bundles were less warped, as if they had been reinforced. The way a small section of insulation had been cut and replaced to allow easier access to the cavity above. The way the ladder opening aligned almost perfectly with the hidden space in the roof, making it possible for someone to move items up and down without drawing attention. None of this was accidental. The thought that someone might have returned here years ago or even more recently sent a jolt of fear through him. He scanned the attic again, searching for signs of recent disturbance. He found none. The dust lay undisturbed except for his own footprints. The webs were intact. The air felt stale in a way that spoke of long neglect. Still, the question lingered. How could something so carefully hidden remain undiscovered for so long? How many people had lived beneath this roof, unaware of what it sheltered? He tried to imagine the house decades earlier, alive with different occupants, the attic not a forgotten space, but an active one. He imagined men climbing up here, handling these bundles, marking beams, sealing the cavity with care. The images made his stomach turn, not because he could see them clearly, but because he could not. The lack of detail made the possibilities worse. He realized he could not stay here indefinitely, circling the same thoughts. He needed to decide how far he was willing to go on his own. Opening everything might give him clarity, but it might also expose him to danger he was unprepared to handle. Leaving everything untouched might preserve his safety in the short term, but it would leave him living beneath a secret that felt actively hostile. He took out his phone and took photographs, careful to capture the bundles as they were, the clasps, the partial contents he had glimpsed, the surrounding space. He did this not with any intention of sharing them publicly, but as a record, proof that what he had found existed exactly as he found it. He documented the attic, the ladder opening, the marks on the beams. Each image felt like a small anchor in a situation that threatened to pull him into uncertainty. As he worked, he became acutely aware of his isolation. There was no one in the house with him, no one to share the weight of the discovery. He imagined explaining it to someone, anyone, and struggled to find the words. How did you tell another person that your roof had hidden an archive of hate, that your home had been complicit in something violent by virtue of sheltering it? The story sounded unreal even to him, and yet the evidence lay inches away. He sat back against a beam and closed his eyes briefly. The attic creaked softly around him, settling as the house adjusted to the heat of the day. Outside, the world continued unchanged. Inside, he felt suspended between responsibility and fear. He knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that this was not something he could resolve alone. The presence of documents, of organized materials, shifted the situation beyond personal property into the realm of public concern. Yet, he also understood that once he involved others, control would leave his hands. The house would become a site. The attic would become evidence. He would become a witness, perhaps even a target for resentment or blame. The town would have to confront whatever these bundles represented, and towns did not always welcome such confrontations. He opened his eyes and looked once more at the bundles. They sat quietly, patient in their concealment, as if they had waited for exactly this moment. The house had kept its secret for decades, maybe longer, and now it rested on him to decide what would happen next. The roof above no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a reminder that the past, no matter how carefully sealed, could still press downward until someone noticed the weight. He climbed down from the attic slowly, closing the hatch behind him with care. As it settled into place, he felt a strange sense of finality, as though he were sealing himself inside a different version of the house. The living spaces below seemed unchanged, but he knew better now. He moved through them with heightened awareness, listening to every sound, watching light shift across walls that suddenly felt thinner. By the time he reached the front room, his decision was not yet fully formed, but the direction is clear. He could not ignore what he had found. The house had revealed its hidden core, and, in doing so, it had demanded a response. The calm that had settled over him on the roof was gone, replaced by a taut readiness. Whatever lay inside those bundles was not meant to remain buried, and he understood that uncovering it, even partially, had already set events in motion that could not be undone. The house felt different after he closed the attic hatch, as though the ceiling itself had absorbed his knowledge and now pressed it downward into every room. He moved through the space slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the kitchen counter, grounding himself in objects that had always been neutral. Even the familiar hum of the refrigerator seemed altered, too loud in the quiet that followed him. He understood that nothing visible had changed, yet the sense of safety he had been building piece by piece since moving in had fractured. The house had not betrayed him, not intentionally, but it had revealed that it had once served purposes far removed from shelter. He knew he could not leave the bundles unopened forever. The partial glimpses had already transformed them from unknowns into threats shaped by implication. Ignorance would not restore peace. It would only prolong the tension, allowing fear to invent shapes more terrifying than reality might be. He waited until late afternoon, until the light through the windows shifted and the street outside grew quieter, before returning to the attic ladder. The delay was not about courage, but about readiness, a need to steady himself before crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. The attic greeted him with the same oppressive warmth, but now it felt sharper, as if the air itself were alert. He climbed fully inside and pulled the ladder up behind him, not locking himself in, but closing the opening enough to create a sense of separation from the rest of the house. He placed his flashlight on a beam so it cast a steady pool of light over the bundles, then knelt beside the largest one. His hands hovered for a long moment before he touched the clasp, his mind replaying everything he had already learned from fragments and hints. When he finally released the clasp, it opened with a dull metallic sound that echoed too loudly in the confined space. He folded the fabric back carefully, layer by layer, as though respecting some unspoken rule. Inside, the contents were arranged with unsettling care. White robes lay folded flat, their fabric thick and stiff with age. The color was no longer pure, dulled by decades of dust and time, but unmistakable. Beneath them were pointed hoods, their shapes instantly recognizable even before his mind fully accepted what his eyes were seeing. The material was heavy, ceremonial, never meant for comfort. It was meant to transform the wearer, to erase individuality and replace it with something anonymous and cruel. A wave of cold moved through him that had nothing to do with temperature. He had expected something like this after his earlier glimpse, but expectation did not soften the impact. Seeing the garments fully revealed was different from imagining them. They were real, tangible, and they carried with them the weight of history that did not fade simply because the years had passed. He thought of photographs he had seen, black and white images of crowds gathered in fields or streets, faces hidden beneath identical shapes. He thought of the fear those images represented, the violence that often followed their appearances. And now those same symbols lay folded in his attic, inches from his hands. He forced himself to continue. Stopping now would not undo what he had already seen. Beneath the robes were banners, carefully rolled, their edges frayed but their symbols still clear. The stitching was precise, almost proud, as though the maker had believed deeply in what they were creating. He did not unfurl them fully, but he did not need to. The partial reveal was enough to confirm what he had already understood. These were not isolated items. They were part of a larger set, a uniformity that spoke of organization, hierarchy, and intent. He closed the bundle slowly, his movements deliberate, as though speed might shatter what little composure he had left. His breathing had grown shallow, and he paused to steady it before moving on. The next bundle contained more of the same, variations in size and detail that suggested different roles or ranks. Some pieces were marked with subtle differences, stitching patterns or insignia that distinguished them from the rest. The realization that these items had belonged to specific individuals, not an abstract group, made his stomach tighten. These were not anonymous relics. They were personal, worn, used. The third bundle held something different. When he opened it, the smell of old paper rose immediately, dry and brittle. Inside were documents stacked neatly, their edges aligned with care. He lifted the top set gently, afraid they might crumble in his hands. The handwriting was firm and consistent, ink faded but legible. Names filled the pages, accompanied by dates and locations. Some entries were marked with symbols or notations he did not immediately understand. Others were chillingly clear. Addresses, times, notes written in a shorthand that suggested familiarity among those who used it. As he scanned the pages, certain names struck him with a jolt of recognition. They were surnames he had seen around town, on storefronts, on plaques, on street signs. Families that had been woven into the town's identity for generations. The realization that respected figures from the community's past might have been connected to what lay before him made his chest ache with a complicated mix of anger and sorrow. This was not an external evil imposed from elsewhere. It had grown here, nurtured by people who had walked these same streets, lived in houses like his. He moved through the documents carefully, resisting the urge to read too deeply. Dates jumped out at him, aligning with events he had heard referenced obliquely over the years. A fire described in old newspapers as accidental. A disappearance attributed to someone leaving town suddenly. A protest that had ended abruptly without explanation. The connections were not explicit, but they were there, woven subtly through the pages like a map that only made sense once you knew how to read it. The fourth bundle contained photographs. He hesitated before opening it, a sense of dread settling over him that was heavier than before. When he did, the images confirmed his fears. Faces stared back at him from glossy surfaces dulled by age, some obscured by hoods, others fully visible. Backgrounds were familiar. A church he recognized, a crossroads just outside town, a clearing near the river where children now played in the summer. Seeing those places frozen in time alongside symbols of hatred made his skin prickle. The past was no longer distant. It was layered directly beneath the present, inseparable and unresolved. He found himself scanning the photographs not only for places but for faces, terrified that he might recognize someone still living, someone he passed on the street. He did not find any he could place with certainty, but the possibility alone was enough to make his pulse race. These images were evidence, not just of belief, but of action. They documented gatherings, ceremonies, perhaps planning. They captured moments meant to be remembered within a closed circle, never meant to be exposed. The final bundle was the heaviest. When he opened it, he understood why. Inside were metal objects wrapped individually in cloth, He unwrapped one slowly and found a clasp similar to those that sealed the bundles, but more ornate, engraved with symbols that matched those on the banners. These were markers of rank, indicators of authority within the organization. Holding one felt like holding a fragment of power that had once been wielded without restraint. He rewrapped it immediately, unwilling to touch it longer than necessary. By the time he finished examining the contents, his legs had gone numb from kneeling. He sat back against a beam and stared at the closed bundles, his mind struggling to process the scope of what he had uncovered. This was not a single person's secret. It was infrastructure. It was a system preserved deliberately, hidden in a place chosen for its anonymity and safety. His house had not been an innocent bystander. It had been a tool. The personal implications hit him with renewed force. As a black man living alone in this house, the knowledge that it had once sheltered materials designed to terrorize people like him felt like a violation that transcended property. It was as though the walls themselves carried an echo of hostility, one that had been dormant but never erased. He felt anger at the people who had used the house this way, at the systems that had allowed them to operate without consequence, and at the silence that had preserved their secrets for so long. He also felt fear, sharper now that the abstract had become concrete. These items were evidence of crimes, even if the crimes themselves were decades old. Possessing them, even unintentionally, placed him in a precarious position. If someone else knew about this cache, if someone believed it should remain hidden, he could become a target simply for discovering it. The thought made him glance instinctively toward the attic walls, as if expecting them to whisper. He considered, briefly, the idea of putting everything back exactly as it had been, sealing the roof properly and saying nothing. The town would remain unchanged. The past would stay buried. His life might return to a fragile normal, but the thought left a bitter taste. Silence was what had allowed this to persist. Silence was part of the harm. And now that he had seen, truly seen, pretending otherwise felt impossible. He took more photographs, documenting each bundle's contents carefully, ensuring that nothing could be questioned later. He did not trust memory alone to carry this weight. As he worked, the last light of day filtered through the attic window, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. The house creaked softly, adjusting to the cooling air. It sounded almost like a sigh, though he knew better than to ascribe intention to wood and nails. When he finally closed the last bundle and stood, his body felt heavy, as though gravity itself had increased. He understood now that the discovery was not just shocking, it was transformative. The house could never return to being simply a fixer-upper on a quiet street. It had become a site of reckoning, whether he wanted that role or not. He climbed down from the attic slowly, carrying with him not objects but knowledge that pressed against his thoughts. The rooms below looked unchanged, but he moved through them differently now, aware of the thinness of the boundaries between past and present. Outside, the sky darkened into evening, neighbors settling into their routines, unaware of the storm that had broken open above his ceiling. Standing in the living room, he realized that the choice before him was no longer whether to act, but how quickly. The contents of the attic had stripped away the illusion of neutrality. They demanded response, accountability, exposure. And as the house settled around him, holding its breath in the quiet, he understood that the next step would push this private horror into the open, where it would collide with the town's carefully maintained sense of itself. After climbing down from the attic, he stood for a long time in the narrow hallway, staring at the closed hatch above his head. It no longer looked like a simple panel in the ceiling. It looked sealed, intentional, like a lid placed over something that was never meant to surface. The knowledge of what rested above him pressed down with an almost physical weight, altering his perception of the house room by room. Walls that had once felt thin but harmless now seemed complicit. The familiar creaks of the structure settling sounded different, no longer neutral noises of an old building, but reminders that this place had carried secrets quietly and without protest. He moved into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, but his hands shook enough that some spilled onto the counter. He wiped it away automatically, the motion grounding him only slightly. His reflection in the darkened window startled him. He looked older than he had that morning, his face drawn tight by strain. This house, which had represented stability and a hard-won foothold in life, now felt like a snare. He had walked into it willingly, believing he could repair its flaws one by one, never suspecting that the most dangerous damage had been hidden so carefully it required a storm to expose it. Everywhere he went, his mind replayed what he had seen. The folded robes, the lists of names, the photographs of places he knew too well. He imagined the house decades ago, occupied by people who moved through it with purpose, climbing into the attic not as a chore, but as a routine. The thought made his stomach knot. He realized that this building had once been a node in something larger, a quiet outpost in a network built on fear and silence. That meant the house itself was not incidental. It had been chosen. That realization triggered a new kind of panic. If the house had been chosen once, could it still be known to someone now? The bundles had not been disturbed recently, but that did not guarantee they were forgotten. People passed things down. Secrets survived through stories, hints, warnings. He began to wonder whether some of the neighbors knew more than they let on, whether the uneasy distance he had felt since moving in was rooted in more than simple unfamiliarity. He forced himself to slow down and think practically. Panic would only make him reckless. He walked through the house and checked the locks on the doors, something he had done absent-mindedly many times before, but now each click sounded too loud. He checked the windows, drawing the curtains even though night had not fully fallen. He told himself he was being cautious, not paranoid, but the distinction felt thin. From the front window, he watched the street. A couple of neighbors were outside, talking near a driveway. They laughed, relaxed, unaware of the storm of history unfolding just a few houses away. Further down, a car rolled slowly past, then slowed again, as if the driver were looking for an address. The car continued on, but his heart did not settle. Every ordinary movement now carried the possibility of threat. He sat on the edge of the couch and tried to consider his options. One choice was silence. He could reseal the attic, repair the roof properly, and pretend the discovery had never happened. The items would remain hidden, protected from decay, and his life might continue with only the burden of knowledge weighing on him. But the more he considered it, the less viable it seemed. Those materials were evidence of real harm. Even if the crimes themselves were decades old, the ideology they represented was not. Silence would not just protect him. It would protect whatever legacy those objects carried. The second choice was to tell someone privately, perhaps a historian or a lawyer, someone who could advise him without immediately turning the house into a crime scene. That idea held brief appeal, but it fell apart under scrutiny. Anyone he told would have to make decisions of their own. Control would still slip from his hands, only more slowly and with greater risk of misinterpretation. Worse, Involving someone unofficially could expose him to accusations of tampering or concealment later. The third choice was the one that frightened him most: to contact the authorities directly. Police involvement meant scrutiny, questions, procedures. It meant his name attached to the discovery, his house photographed, searched, discussed. It meant neighbors speculating, media attention, perhaps even hostility from people who did not want the past disturbed. Yet, it was also the only option that placed responsibility where it belonged, away from him alone. As he weighed these possibilities, the house seemed to close in around him. The rooms felt smaller, the ceilings lower. He found himself listening for sounds that had never concerned him before. A thump from the neighboring yard made him tense. The faint whine of tires on asphalt sounded like approach rather than passing. He realized that the house, once a refuge from uncertainty, had become a place of constant vigilance. He returned to the hallway and looked up at the attic hatch again. He imagined someone else knowing it was there, knowing what it concealed, and watching the house from a distance. The thought was enough to push him toward action. He could not live with the possibility that someone might come looking for those items, might decide that retrieving them was worth confronting the current owner. The danger was not hypothetical anymore. It was rooted in the very real history of violence and intimidation that those objects represented. He decided that if he was going to act, he needed to do so carefully. He took out his phone and reviewed the photographs he had taken, ensuring they were clear and time-stamped. He organized them into a folder, labeling it with the date and location. He did not know exactly who would see them, but he wanted a record that showed he had not staged or altered anything. He also wrote down a timeline of events in his notes, starting with the storm, the leak, the discovery on the roof, and the movement of the bundles into the attic. The act of writing helped steady his thoughts, turning chaos into sequence. He gathered the documents related to the house purchase and set them aside, knowing he might need to prove ownership and explain why he had been on the roof in the first place. He thought about how this might look from the outside. A man finds extremist materials in his attic. The situation was ripe for suspicion, especially in a town where he already felt like an outsider. He needed to be prepared for that reality, however unfair it was. As night settled in, the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting pale circles of light along the road. From his window, he saw shadows move as neighbors returned inside. The neighborhood grew quieter, but the silence only sharpened his unease. He imagined what would happen if he waited until morning. Another night spent under the same roof as those objects, knowing what they were, felt unbearable. He paced the living room, stopping occasionally to listen at the door or glance out the window. The house no longer felt passive. It felt like an accomplice that had been exposed and now waited to see what he would do. The longer he stayed silent, the more it felt as though the house itself was holding him hostage to its past. Finally, he sat at the small table near the kitchen and placed his phone in front of him. His finger hovered over the screen, his heart pounding hard enough that he could feel it in his throat. Calling for help meant surrendering control, but not calling meant accepting responsibility for something far larger than himself. He thought of the faces in the photographs, of the names on the lists, of the quiet suffering implied by dates and places. He thought of himself, of how easily his presence in this house could have gone unnoticed by history if the storm had not come. The decision crystallized not as a burst of courage, but as a weary acceptance. He could not fix this the way he fixed a leaking pipe or a broken step. This was not a problem that could be solved with tools and persistence alone. It required exposure, however painful that might be for the town and for him. He picked up the phone, then set it down again, taking one last look around the room. The furniture, the walls, the floors, all the things he had worked so hard to make his own, seemed fragile now, like props in a story that had suddenly grown larger than him. He realized that whatever happened next, his relationship with this house would never be simple again. It would always be the place where the past reached up through the roof and grabbed hold of his present. When he picked up the phone again, his hand was steadier. Fear had not left him, but it had settled into something sharper and more focused. The house had become a trap, not because it was dangerous on its own, but because it held something that could not be ignored. And he understood, with quiet clarity, that the only way out of that trap was forward, into consequences he could not yet fully imagine. The phone felt heavier than it should have when he finally lifted it, as if the weight of the decision had transferred into the object itself. He sat at the kitchen table, the light above him casting a dull yellow circle that barely touched the corners of the room. Outside, night had settled fully over the street. The ordinary sounds of the neighborhood had thinned to distant engines and the occasional bark of a dog, each noise sharp in the quiet. He understood that once he made the call, nothing would belong solely to him anymore. The house, the attic, the bundles, even his private fear would be drawn into a wider space where explanations and judgments waited. He dialed 911 and held the phone to his ear, his breath shallow as the line connected. When the operator answered, he forced himself to speak slowly, clearly, resisting the urge to rush through the words as if speed might make the situation easier. He explained that he was the homeowner, that he had discovered something hidden in the structure of his house during roof repairs, that what he found appeared to be extremist materials from decades past. He emphasized that he felt unsafe and unsure how to proceed, that the items were numerous and carefully concealed. As he spoke, he became acutely aware of how unreal the story sounded, even to himself. He half expected to be interrupted, to be asked to repeat himself, to be met with skepticism. Instead, the operator's tone remained steady, professional, grounded. Questions followed, methodical and precise. Where was the house located? Was anyone else present? Had he touched or moved the items? Did he believe there was an immediate threat? He answered as honestly as he could, explaining that he had moved the items from the roof cavity to the attic to prevent damage, that he had not removed anything from the property, that he did not believe there was an active threat but could not be sure. Saying the words out loud made the situation feel more real, more irreversible. Each answer seemed to close a door behind him. When the operator told him that officers would be dispatched to his location, his chest tightened with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that he would no longer be alone with this knowledge. Dread because the arrival of police would make the situation visible to the world outside his walls. He was instructed to remain inside, to avoid touching the items further, and to keep his phone nearby. He ended the call and sat very still, listening to the faint hum of the line disconnecting. The minutes that followed stretched unnaturally. He stood and walked to the front window, parting the curtain just enough to see the street. The house across from him was dark, its occupants already asleep or pretending to be. Down the block, a porch light flicked on, then off again. He wondered how long it would take for police to arrive, and how the street would look once they did. He imagined flashing lights reflecting off windows, silhouettes gathering behind curtains, whispers starting before facts had a chance to form. The waiting sharpened his senses. Every sound made him tense. A passing car slowed his breathing until it moved on. The refrigerator clicked on and off, startling him more than it should have. He kept his phone in his hand, as if it were a lifeline rather than a device. Time felt distorted, each minute heavy with expectation. When he finally heard sirens in the distance, his stomach clenched. The sound grew louder, nearer, until red and blue light spilled across the front of the house, washing the siding and lawn in pulsing color. He stepped back from the window, suddenly unsure where to stand, what to do with his hands. A knock followed shortly after, firm but not aggressive. He took a breath, reminding himself that he had done the right thing, that fear did not mean mistake. He opened the door to find two officers standing on the porch, their expressions serious but neutral. The lights from the patrol cars illuminated the street behind them, revealing neighbors emerging cautiously from their homes. He identified himself, and after a brief exchange, the officers stepped inside. The threshold crossing felt symbolic, as though the private boundary of his home had dissolved the moment they entered. They listened as he recounted the discovery again, this time in more detail. He showed them the photographs on his phone, explaining where the items had been found and how he had accessed the cavity beneath the roof. One of the officers took notes while the other observed the house, his gaze lingering briefly on the ceiling, as if already picturing the hidden space above. Their professionalism was reassuring, but it did not erase the sense that his home was slipping from his control. They asked to see the attic. He led them down the hallway and pulled the hatch open, the ladder unfolding with a familiar creak. As they climbed up, he remained below, feeling strangely excluded from his own space. He listened to their footsteps overhead, the murmur of voices muffled by insulation and wood. When one of them called down that they needed additional units and specialists, his heart sank. The situation was expanding, just as he had feared. Within minutes, more vehicles arrived. The quiet street transformed into a scene of official activity. Tape was strung across the front yard, and officers began gently but firmly directing curious neighbors to keep their distance. He watched through the window as people gathered in small clusters, phones raised, faces lit by screens and speculation. He recognized some of them, people who had nodded politely in passing but never spoken to him at length. Now they watched his house as if it were something foreign, something dangerous. Inside, the atmosphere changed as well. The initial officers were joined by others who carried equipment and spoke in more technical terms. He caught fragments of conversation about documentation, chain of custody, and historical context. It became clear that the discovery was being treated not as a curiosity, but as a significant find. The bundles in the attic were no longer just his problem. They were evidence. An officer asked him to sit and answer more questions. He complied, describing his purchase of the house, his lack of prior knowledge, the condition of the roof. He was careful with his words, aware that every detail mattered now. He felt exposed, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he understood how easily narratives could be twisted. Being the one who found the items did not automatically make him the one who would be believed. As the investigation progressed, specialists arrived who treated the attic with particular care. He saw them carry up containers, gloves, and tools designed to preserve fragile materials. They photographed everything before touching it, documenting the placement of each bundle, each mark on the beams. The thoroughness was impressive and unsettling. Watching strangers methodically take ownership of the space where he had lived quietly for months made him feel like a guest in his own home. Outside, the presence of police drew more attention. A local news van appeared at the end of the street, its logo stark against the dark. He realized then that the story would not stay contained within official reports. It would spread, shaped by speculation and incomplete information long before facts were confirmed. The thought made him uneasy, but it also reinforced that secrecy was no longer possible, nor desirable. At one point, an officer informed him that the house would need to be temporarily secured as a potential site connected to historical crimes. The words were careful, but the implication was clear. His home would be treated as a location of interest, and that came with procedures and limitations. He nodded, understanding that this was the consequence of the choice he had made. Still, hearing it spoken aloud felt like another loss layered atop the first. As the night wore on, the bundles were carefully removed from the attic and carried out of the house. He watched through the open doorway as they were loaded into a vehicle, each one labeled and sealed. Seeing them leave brought a strange mix of relief and emptiness. The physical presence of the items had been oppressive, but their removal did not restore peace. Instead, it emphasized how deeply they had altered everything. Neighbors whispered as the vehicles departed. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with suspicion, a few with expressions he could not read at all. He understood that stories were already forming, that some would paint him as a troublemaker, others as a victim, others as something in between. He felt too tired to care which version would take hold. When the last officer finally sat down across from him to explain what would happen next, his body felt heavy with exhaustion. The officer spoke about follow-up interviews, about potential involvement of historians and archivists, about the importance of preserving the materials properly. He listened, nodding, absorbing the information without fully processing it. The scale of what he had set in motion was only beginning to register. After the police left, the house felt eerily quiet. The attic hatch remained open, a reminder of the night's events. He closed it slowly, almost reverently, and stood beneath it for a long moment. The house had been searched, documented, altered by the presence of authority. It no longer belonged solely to him in any meaningful sense. He sat alone in the living room, the silence pressing in again, but different now. The fear had not vanished, but it had shifted. He was no longer trapped in indecision. He had chosen a path, and though it led into uncertainty, it was a path that moved forward rather than inward. He thought again of the storm, of the leak that had forced him onto the roof. What had seemed like an ordinary misfortune had become a catalyst, tearing open a seam that had held for generations. As he turned off the lights and prepared for a restless attempt at sleep, one thought remained clear above all others. He had not gone looking for this history. It had been waiting, embedded in the structure of his life, until circumstance brought it into the open. And now that it was exposed, it would not be buried again, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might prove to be. The morning after the police left, the house no longer felt like a private place. Even in the quiet, even with the street returning to its usual rhythm, there was a lingering sense that eyes were still on it, that its walls had become transparent in a way they never had been before. He woke after only a few hours of restless sleep, his thoughts heavy and tangled, the events of the night replaying in fragments rather than sequence. The attic hatch remained firmly closed, yet its presence dominated the ceiling, a silent reminder that the house had crossed a boundary from ordinary to significant. Within days, the investigation widened beyond the initial police response. Detectives returned, this time accompanied by people who introduced themselves as historians, archivists, and specialists in extremist movements of the early 20th century. Their presence shifted the tone of everything. This was no longer just a matter of securing evidence or determining whether a crime had recently occurred. It was about understanding what the house had been part of and what the materials found inside it represented in a broader historical context. They treated the house with a mixture of caution and reverence, as though aware that it stood at the intersection of past and present. They asked him to recount the discovery again, slowly, carefully, encouraging him to remember details that had seemed insignificant at the time. The exact placement of the roof tiles, the layering of boards, the way the bundles had been arranged. Each detail mattered, not just for procedural accuracy, but because it helped reconstruct intent. This was not a random hiding place. It was designed. As records were examined, a clearer picture began to form. Property documents revealed that the house had changed ownership multiple times during the 1910s and 1920s, often passing through trusts or intermediaries rather than direct sales. These transfers coincided with periods of increased activity by extremist groups in the region, a fact corroborated by newspaper archives and court records that had long been forgotten or quietly ignored. The house, it seemed, had been ideally located, far enough from the town center to avoid attention, close enough to remain accessible, and structurally suited to concealment. The historians pored over the documents removed from the attic, their gloved hands moving with careful precision. They identified the handwriting styles, dated the paper stock, and analyzed the ink. The results confirmed what he had already suspected. The materials dated back to the early 1920s, a time when such groups operated openly in many parts of the country, often with the tacit support or active involvement of local leaders. The metal clasps, once just curious details, were identified as markers associated with high-ranking members, custom-made rather than mass-produced. As names from the documents were cross-referenced with municipal records, the atmosphere grew heavier. Several surnames belonged to individuals who had once held positions of authority in the town. Former council members, business owners whose families still operated shops on the main street, a past church deacon, a former sheriff's deputy. The realization sent ripples through the investigation team and beyond. This was no fringe cell operating in isolation. It was embedded, respected, protected. The town reacted slowly at first, then all at once. News of the discovery spread through official statements and media reports, each one carefully worded but impossible to soften. Residents who had lived their entire lives believing in a sanitized version of local history were forced to confront evidence that contradicted it. Some reacted with shock and sorrow, others with denial and anger. There were those who insisted the past should remain buried, that reopening old wounds served no purpose. But the presence of physical evidence made dismissal impossible. Public meetings were held, first quietly, then with increasing tension. Historians presented findings. Law enforcement explained the scope of the investigation. Journalists filled notebooks and recorded reactions. The house became a reference point, its address spoken aloud in rooms where uncomfortable truths were debated. He attended some of these meetings, sitting quietly at the back, listening as people argued over history that had quite literally been hidden above his head. Not everyone welcomed the exposure. Anonymous messages began appearing online, questioning the motives behind the investigation. Some implied that the discovery had been exaggerated. Others suggested that he had planted the materials himself. The insinuations were subtle at first, then more overt. He learned quickly how fragile public sympathy could be when it collided with deeply ingrained narratives. The idea that respected families might have dark legacies was easier to reject than to examine. Despite this resistance, the investigation pressed on. Archivists uncovered correspondence that connected the documents from the attic to known events in the region. Patterns emerged, linking meetings listed in the documents to nights when acts of intimidation or violence had occurred. The house had served as a storage point and, at times, a meeting place. The attic markings, once dismissed as random, were now understood as organizational indicators, notes left by people who had believed their work righteous and permanent. One of the most significant moments came when an elderly resident came forward. He had been a child during the period in question, old enough to remember whispers and warnings, young enough to have been shielded from explanations. Seeing the photographs from the attic, recognizing locations and symbols, had stirred memories he had buried for decades. He spoke carefully, haltingly, about men who gathered at night, about routes people avoided after dark, about a fear that had been normalized because it was never named. His testimony did not add new names to the list, but it gave emotional weight to the evidence, transforming records into lived experience. As the scope of the investigation became clear, it also became evident that the house was not unique. References in the documents pointed to other locations, other properties that may have served similar purposes. Some were long gone, replaced by newer buildings. Others still stood, unremarkable, occupied by families who had no idea what their walls might conceal. The discovery in his attic was not an isolated anomaly. It was a key that unlocked a wider pattern. Throughout all of this, he remained caught between roles. To some, he was a catalyst, the person whose accidental discovery forced a reckoning. To others, he was an inconvenience, a reminder that the past was not as clean as they preferred. He tried to stay grounded, reminding himself that he had not sought this responsibility. It had come to him through circumstance and chance, through a leaking roof and a willingness to investigate rather than ignore. The house itself underwent a further examination. Structural experts documented the alterations made to conceal the attic space, adding their findings to the growing body of evidence. The idea that such modifications had been planned and executed with care reinforced the conclusion that this was not a matter of personal storage, but of organizational strategy. The house had been a tool, adapted to serve an ideology that thrived on secrecy. At times, the weight of it all felt overwhelming. He found himself longing for the simplicity of the days before the storm, when his biggest concern had been water stains and repair estimates. Yet, he also recognized that ignorance would not have spared him from the reality the house carried. The truth had been there all along, pressing quietly against the roof, waiting for a moment of weakness to break through. As weeks passed, the town changed subtly. Conversations shifted. Memorial plaques were questioned. Old photographs were re-examined. The idea of history as something fixed and settled gave way to a more uncomfortable understanding of it as layered and contested. The investigation did not undo the harm of the past, but it stripped away the comfort of denial. For him, the most difficult part was navigating the personal consequences. His home was no longer just his home. It was a reference point in reports and articles, a site people discussed with a mix of curiosity and unease. Some neighbors avoided him now, unwilling to meet his gaze. Others offered quiet words of support, acknowledging the courage it took to speak up rather than seal the roof and move on. Through it all, he returned each night to the same house, now emptied of its hidden contents but still marked by their absence. The attic was quieter, lighter, but not cleansed. It felt like a wound that had been opened and examined, not yet healed. He understood that healing would not come from forgetting, but from acknowledgement and accountability, processes that were only just beginning. The investigation continued, branching outward, connecting threads that had long been left loose. And as the town grappled with what it was learning about itself, he stood at the center of a story that had begun with a simple act of home repair and grown into a confrontation with history. The house had given up its secret, and in doing so, it had changed not just his life, but the narrative of an entire community. When the last official vehicle left the street and the yellow tape was finally taken down, the silence that followed felt different from before. It was not the uneasy quiet of secrecy or anticipation, but a heavier, settled stillness, the kind that comes after something irreversible has occurred. The house stood exactly where it always had, unchanged in shape and size, yet fundamentally altered. Its walls no longer carried hidden weight, but they bore the imprint of what had been removed, like a body remembering pain even after a wound has closed. The attic was empty now. The bundles, the documents, the artifacts that had defined weeks of investigation were gone, transferred under formal agreements to archives and museums where they would be preserved, studied, and displayed with context rather than reverence. The experts had explained the process carefully, emphasizing that these objects would not be hidden again, that their purpose now was to educate rather than intimidate. Hearing that had brought him a measure of relief, though it did not erase the images that lingered in his mind. He knew that somewhere, behind glass and labels, the items from his attic would become part of a larger story, one that refused to let the past remain comfortably distant. The house itself required attention again, in ways both practical and symbolic. The roof still needed proper repair. Temporary fixes could not stand against future storms, and for the first time since the discovery, he found himself able to think about shingles and boards without immediately recalling what had once been hidden beneath them. Contractors came to assess the damage, their conversations focused on materials and timelines rather than history. None of them spoke about the attic, though he sensed they knew. In a town like this, knowledge traveled faster than courtesy. As repairs progressed, he spent time alone in the attic, not to search for secrets but to reclaim the space. He swept away dust that had accumulated over decades, erased faint marks on the beams, and reinforced the floor where it had once borne the weight of hidden objects. Each small act felt deliberate, a way of asserting that the house now answered to him, not to the ghosts of its past. The emptiness up there was unsettling at first, like silence after prolonged noise, but gradually began to feel clean rather than hollow. Downstairs, life resumed its routines with cautious adjustments. Neighbors passed by again, some offering nods that were more genuine than before, others maintaining a polite distance. A few stopped to speak, expressing gratitude or admiration in careful words, as if unsure how to approach someone who had become associated with such a charged revelation. There were also those who avoided the street entirely, choosing routes that took them elsewhere rather than past his house. He accepted all of it as part of the cost of truth. The town itself continued to grapple with the consequences of the investigation. Historical markers were revisited. Public records were digitized and made more accessible. Schools introduced revised local history units, acknowledging events that had once been glossed over or ignored. None of these changes erased what had happened, but they marked a shift away from denial. The discomfort was widespread, and that discomfort he understood was necessary. For him, the most profound change was internal. The house no longer represented merely survival or stubborn persistence. It had become a testament to confrontation, to the idea that stability did not come from silence, but from engagement, however painful. He realized that owning a home was not just about walls and roofs. It was about stewardship, about understanding what a place had been before you arrived and deciding what it would become under your care. There were moments when he wondered what his life might have looked like if the storm had never come, if the leak had never forced him onto the roof. He imagined a quieter existence, focused on gradual repairs and modest routines. That life felt distant now, almost unreal. Yet he did not regret the path that had unfolded. The knowledge he carried was heavy, but it was also clarifying. It had stripped away illusions he had not known he held, about safety, about neutrality, about the idea that the past could be compartmentalized and left untouched. The house, once a source of anxiety, began to feel like something else entirely. Not redeemed, perhaps, but honest. It no longer concealed what it had been part of. It stood openly, its story known, its role acknowledged. That transparency changed how he moved through its rooms. He no longer felt watched by unseen histories. Instead, he felt anchored, aware that the space he occupied had been reclaimed through understanding rather than denial. On a quiet afternoon, weeks after the final report was filed, he stood in the yard and looked up at the repaired roof. The shingles lay flat and uniform now, the seams clean, the structure sound. Nothing about it suggested what had once been hidden beneath, and that was as it should be. The purpose of exposure was not to leave scars visible forever, but to ensure that what caused them could not return unseen. The thought about the people who would walk these streets in the years to come. Children riding bicycles, families moving into houses without knowing every detail of their histories. They would inherit a town changed by honesty, however imperfectly. That knowledge gave him a quiet sense of resolve. He had not set out to alter anything beyond his own living conditions, yet circumstance had placed him at the center of a reckoning that extended far beyond his property lines. As evening settled in, he went inside and closed the door, the familiar sound grounding him once more. The house was still old, still imperfect, still demanding care and attention, but it was no longer a vessel for someone else's secrecy. It was his, fully and without reservation. The past had passed through it, left its mark, and been brought into the light. What remained was a space shaped by choice, by responsibility, and by the understanding that truth, once uncovered, could become a foundation rather than a burden. Standing in the quiet of his living room, he felt something he had not expected when he first climbed onto the roof weeks earlier. Not triumph, not relief in any simple sense, but a steadier emotion, something like belonging. The house had tested him, challenged him, forced him to confront histories he had not sought. And, in meeting that challenge, he had claimed more than ownership. He had claimed agency, the right to decide what kind of story this place would carry forward. Outside, the street lights flickered on, illuminating a neighborhood that continued to evolve, however slowly. Inside, the house settled around him, no longer holding its breath. It was just a house again, but with a new meaning layered into its walls, one that would not be forgotten and would not be hidden. If this story made you think, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos, where hidden histories and unexpected discoveries come to light. Watch the other stories on the channel. Some of them will change the way you look at the world. And if this video affected you, share it with others. The truth matters when it's seen by more people.